I think we all know that historically pros hate switching rackets, but in 2025 we've seen a ton of changes ranging from minor tweaks to full-on racket switches. So what exactly is going on the Pro Tour? Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets Runners. Now first of all, if you watch that intro and you're thinking, Luca, what are you talking about? I see Novak Djokovic with a new head speed every year. Well, unfortunately, you've fallen for the big brand's favorite trick. Djokovic has endorsed the Auxetic 2.0, Graphene, pretty much every version of the Speed Pro that's ever come out, but he's never actually used any of those rackets. For most of his career, Djokovic has used some variation of the head liquid metal Radical that came out almost 30 years ago now. Don't ask me why he's not using the Radical, because that's at least technically closer to his real racket. But yeah, Head paints his racket to look like the Speed Pro, but he's never used anything like it, and that's true for a lot of professional players. Pros are paid to endorse a line, but underneath those paint jobs is usually something very different and probably much older. Why is that? Well, that's because tennis is a sport of precision, confidence, and superstition. Like any athlete, tennis players need to have 100% confidence in their equipment, but the tennis racket isn't just any old piece of gear. The racket is a player's only connection to the ball, so it's as important as the foot is in soccer, the arm is for a quarterback, or the cardiovascular system is for a runner. It's not technically a part of their body, but tennis players develop such an important connection to their racket that it effectively becomes an extension of their arm. That's why they're so reluctant to switch things up. Think about it. If someone came up to you and said, you can replace your arm with the latest and greatest version of an arm, you probably say no.
No, I don't think I will.
Maybe it performs a little better, but you know your arm. You've been living with it for however many years. You know what it can do, what it can't do, and because of that, you know how to get the most out of it. It's a similar thing with a tennis racket. Maybe there's a small marginal increase in performance thanks to the latest and greatest technology, but it's not worth the time it's going to take to redevelop that sensation that the racket is an extension of their arm. Well, that was the traditional way of looking at it, but you can rip up that rulebook now, because in 2025, that's just not true anymore. There have been a ton of setup changes, both on the ATP and the WTA, way more than we've ever seen in a calendar year, which begs the question, why? Why are pros all of a sudden so willing, and better yet, insistent on changing up their rackets? Has something changed on the tour? Has the game evolved past older technology? Is modern technology that much better that it trumps whatever connection players have developed with their racket? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. It's going to be a bit of a different video. I'm going to talk about some of those high-profile switches, why they might be happening, and also why this might speak to the general evolution of tennis that also applies at a recreational level. Of course, I am going to talk about some specific rackets today, so remember that you can check any of them out on our website, racketsandrunners.ca. Also, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me in the store on Instagram, and let me know in the comment section what you want me to cover next. The first thing we need to talk about is the power shift that's happened in tennis. At this point, it's pretty much undeniable. Both tennis courts and tennis balls have gotten significantly slower, especially in the past few years. Courts we've known about for a while, tournaments like Wimbledon and the Australian Open have gradually slowed down their surfaces to increase rally time in hopes that it increases spectacle, but balls in particular have become significantly slower in the post-COVID era. The quality of balls has gone down, which is part of the reason why they're slower, and high-profile players like Zverev, Medvedev, and Djokovic have all publicly come out to criticize the balls. But why is a slow ball actually a problem? Slower courts combined with slower balls make it much more difficult to generate pace. For players like Zverev, Djokovic, and Medvedev, who don't take huge swings on every shot and prefer to redirect pace, that's particularly problematic. Pace redirection isn't meant to instantly finish off a point the way a big Alcaraz forehand would, for example. Redirecting pace is a tactic to slowly take control of a rally by taking time away from your opponent and then eventually hitting a winner or forcing a mistake. It's a methodical game style where marginal differences in timing are very important, so a small change in power is actually going to make for a pretty big difference overall. Because of these slower courts and slower balls, that pace redirection doesn't penetrate through the court as much, which gives the opposing player more time to run it down, effectively weakening that style of play. The bottom line is that with these slower balls and slower courts, these slower ball strikers need more free power for their game style to be effective. They can either change the way they play to be more naturally powerful like Alcaraz and Sinner, or they can turn to their equipment to get more free power out of their racket, and that's exactly what they're doing. Djokovic has been slowly tweaking his racket to be more powerful pretty much ever since he started playing, but Zverev and Medvedev in particular have made major changes to their racket setups recently. We're going to start with Zverev because despite having a very successful 2024, he decided to switch to a whole new racket this year. Zverev had been using a Pro Stock Gravity Pro, or the original Speed MP, which is basically the same mold as the Gravity Pro. He'd been using that racket his whole career. In 2025, he switched to the Head Gravity Tour. Not the new 98 square inch Gravity Tour, but actually the old 100 square inch 18x20 Gravity Tour, which was my racket for a very long time. And the big difference between this and the Pro is that this has a thicker beam. The Gravity Pro has a super thin 20mm beam. The Gravity Tour has a 22mm beam, and those 2 extra millimeters give him more free power in exchange for slightly less control. Other than that, the two rackets are pretty much identical, but 2 extra millimeters in beam thickness actually makes for a pretty big difference in feel, which certainly takes time to adapt to, but Zverev clearly thinks that's worth it for the long-term boost in power. Roger Federer went through a similar switch when he developed the RF97. He was looking for more free power to end points quickly as he got older to avoid putting more strain on his body. I don't want to get too into what Federer was actually using before switching to the RF97, but that racket had at maximum a 17.5mm beam, which is obviously ridiculously thin. The RF has a much thicker 21.5mm beam. It also has a much bigger head size, so this comparison isn't perfect, but the point is that thicker beam gives you much more pop off the string bed for more free power. Back to Zverev though, he clearly thinks that that boost in power is going to be beneficial for him in the long run. Now let's move on to Medvedev, whose racket journey has been really wild and definitely not as straightforward as Zverev's, but he's essentially looking for the same thing, a boost in power. This actually started in 2023 with his strings. He'd been using Technofiber Razor Code for most of his time with Technofiber, but switched to Razor Code Soft at the Australian Open that year. He did lose first round there, so at first that switch was questionable, but then he went on an absolute tear, making it to his next 5 tournament finals, winning Rotterdam, Qatar, and Dubai back to back to back. He made an even more drastic change in 2024, stringing with Natural Gut in the mains and Razor Code Soft in the crosses. Natural Gut is much softer than any polyester string, which is an even stronger indicator that he's looking for more power. He did go back and forth between full poly and gut and poly hybrids during 2024, but most recently at the 2025 Miami Open, he was using that setup with gut mains and poly crosses. So that's pretty obvious that he's looking for more power there, but the real reason I wanted to bring up Medvedev in this video is because he had an absolutely hilarious post-match interview in Qatar earlier this year. After he dropped the first set against Khachanov, he switched to a racket that he describes as the racket that fires full power. Now, I don't know if he grabbed a racket with a really powerful string setup or if he actually has a more powerful Technofiber racket in his bag, but it ended up working out because he won the match. One thing is for sure though, he is not happy with the current state of pro tennis, because in that post-match interview, he complained about slow balls and slow courts for the millionth time. He also said that he grabbed that racket as a last resort because its power could have ended up making him miss every shot, which I find hilarious. I don't know how Technofiber feels about that, but Medvedev is Medvedev, you gotta love the honesty. Here's the thing though, what he said about a power racket potentially making him miss every shot does bring up a good point. Wanting more power sounds great on paper, but actually switching to something more powerful is much easier said than done. More power has historically meant less control, and the difference in playability between power and control rackets has, at least at some point, been pretty huge. During the 2000s and 2010s, you had control rackets on one side and power rackets on the other. Control rackets, which are also known as players' rackets, had really small head sizes, constant thin beams, and tight string beds, and then power rackets were much stiffer, thicker, with 100 square inch head sizes and more open string beds. The difference in feel between these two styles was huge, so if a pro was playing with a control racket and wanted more power, that change in playability was way too big to ever consider a switch. In 2025, that's just not the case anymore, because brands realized there was a gap in the market and started developing what I like to call modern players rackets. I'm going to go into detail now about what makes these rackets so special, because the rise of modern players rackets is one of the major reasons why pros are so comfortable switching rackets nowadays. Modern players rackets are rackets that color the lines between power and control. They're sort of hybrid rackets, and to better explain their great playability, I'm going to talk about the first successful modern players racket, the E-Zone 98. This is the DR 98, not the original E-Zone 98. But that first E-Zone was truly a watershed racket for the tennis industry. It came out in the early 2010s and it had a 98 square inch head size, but unlike most of the 98s of that time, it had a variable beam with a thick hoop and a thin throat. The thick hoop made it more powerful than the average 98, and then the thin throat and the smaller head size meant that it wasn't nearly as uncontrollable as 100 square inch power rackets. So obviously more power than control rackets sounds great, but there's still the issue that usually pros value control over anything else, because control is what gives them confidence. Even if the E-Zone is more controlled than a power racket, if it doesn't provide you with that same level of confidence as a control racket, that increase in power isn't worth it. But that's not the case with the E-Zone because of this racket's X factor, its spin. You see, this modern beam design doesn't just make this racket more powerful, it also makes this racket more spin-friendly than control rackets. By the time the first E-Zone came out, spin had become so important for control in tennis that whatever this racket lacked in traditional control, it made up for in spin. That blend of power, spin, and control became lethal in the hands of advanced players, and sure enough, the E-Zone 98 became one of the most popular rackets on tour. Other brands logically wanted a piece of that pie and started developing their own modern players' rackets, and in 2025 we have a plethora of options in this category. The VCore 98, Aero 98, and the Extreme Pro, just to name a few. The key element with these rackets is that thanks to their combination of a smaller 98 square inch head size and their spin, they provide players with modern technique an equal amount of confidence as more classic 98s. That means more power without losing control, because control and confidence essentially mean the same thing in tennis. So it's no surprise that with the power crisis going on, players who had previously been using more traditional players' rackets are now switching to these modern players' rackets. Where better to start than with the most successful racket switch of the year, or honestly probably the most successful racket switch of all time, Madison Keys. She'd been using a Wilson Pro Stock H19 1820 throughout most of her career, which has tons of control and pretty much no free power. Seriously, if you can get your hands on one of these, it's one of the most traditional controlled experiences you can find. She did switch to the H22 in 2024, which are thicker and more powerful, but definitely still full-on control rackets. And then she surprised everyone in 2025, showing up to Australia with these blacked out rackets that were definitely not Wilson's, and it quickly became obvious that they were E-Zone 98s. I'm not sure exactly which version of the E-Zone she's using. I'm guessing probably the current one because she has no prior experience with it, but honestly that's not too important. What's important is that the E-Zone 98 is way more powerful than both her H19 and H22, so Madison Keys clearly went into the year looking for more power to complement her aggressive style of play. Now I think we all know it worked out pretty well for her. She won the Australian Open, having never won a slam before. I also find it absolutely hilarious that her rackets were blacked out the whole tournament, because that might be the biggest marketing fail ever from Yonex. Imagine you have the opportunity to say, hey look, a pro switched from our competitor's racket to our newest racket and they won their first major tournament with it, and they can't even take full advantage of that. That's gotta hurt. But anyways, Madison Keys' switch to the E-Zone is an insane success story, and it's also proof that players who like control can still feel just as confident with these more powerful modern players' rackets. She wouldn't have been able to hit as freely with the E-Zone if she felt a lack of confidence compared to her H19 and H22, and that boost in power and spin proved to be exactly what she needed to dominate her opponents even more. The next super successful racket switch story is Stefanos Tsitsipas. Again, I think we've all seen him, or at least seen Beckett's video about him playing with a blacked out racket in the last couple of tournaments. Now Tsitsipas' game is based off of a big serve with heavy power and precision from the baseline, and that brought him plenty of success in his early years, but he's clearly been stagnating a little bit in the post-COVID era. His forehand didn't have that same deadly penetration that it once had, which was probably in part due to a loss of confidence, but also definitely because of the slower balls and the slower courts I was talking about earlier. He's used one of these 1820 blades his whole career, and the 1820 blade is a proper thin beam control racket. He has been experimenting with more powerful strings over the last couple of years, but then he ripped the band-aid off completely with a totally new frame at this year's Dubai Open. And like with Madison Keys, it seems to be exactly what he needed, because he won the Dubai Open after not having won anything since Monte Carlo last year. Seriously, it's kind of insane how successful these racket switch stories have been this year. I'm not saying that's the only reason why they're winning, but it certainly makes for good storytelling. Now again, not necessarily the greatest look for Wilson, because like it was with Madison Keys, Tsitsipas switched away from a Wilson racket to one of their direct competitors. The blacked out racket he's been using is a Babolat Pure Aero 98. The Aero 98 is a fantastic racket that I have talked about a lot on this channel. The main thing compared to the blade is that it provides more free power and spin, as well as a little bit more stability, And the improvements in Tsitsipas' game are very obvious. He's generating way more power on the forehand, and that increase in spin is making the ball even more difficult for his opponents. That spin is also why he's clearly so confident hitting with a racket that's a lot more powerful than he's used to. The ball's not flying on him because that spin is making it dip a lot more. I really can't stress enough how important spin is on these modern players' rackets. If it weren't for their spin, players would not feel nearly as confident as with traditional control rackets, so they wouldn't be able to hit these loose, powerful shots. I know I've said this 3 times already, but I really need to emphasize that that's the magic with these rackets. As long as you have a somewhat modern style and you hit with spin, their design complements that really, really well. Now, another key element to the Aero 98 is its stability. That stability comes from its fairly stiff and thick beam, and it helps to create a really solid feel on contact. Most of these modern players' rackets are more stable than thin, controlled 98s because of these thicker beams. Of course, you can stabilize a thin-beamed racket by adding weight to it, but that also makes it more difficult to swing and bring quickly through contact. This extra stability has really helped Tsitsipas's backhand. Now, his backhand has never been his strength, but more stability at probably a lower weight than his blade, you can tell how confident he is driving through that backhand. I think we all saw that viral clip of his 9.8 backhand quality in a set against Griekspoor. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I don't know exactly what those numbers mean, but one thing's for sure, you could tell his backhand was very good throughout the whole tournament. If you can swing faster with the same level of confidence, you'll naturally generate more power and spin, which is how he's playing that higher quality ball. I'm going to go back to Federer, who also had a one-handed backhand that players like Nadal considered a weakness. Well, after he switched to the RF97, I don't know if you guys remember this, but at Indian Wells in 2017, he absolutely tore Nadal to shreds with that backhand. Nadal was shell-shocked because for the first time ever, high topspin to the backhand wasn't working, but it's because the RF97 was lighter and had way more easy stability than his Pro Staff 90, so kind of like Tsitsipas, he was able to just rip into the ball a lot easier. Now there does come a point where you come back down to earth. Nadal did end up winning again against Federer with that tactic, and Tsitsipas probably isn't going to be hitting 9.8 backhand quality every match, but the important thing is that the marginal improvements are there. So Madison Keys and Stefanos Tsitsipas are 2 players who have successfully switched to more powerful rackets this year, and more players do seem to be following suit. Alexander Bublik's also been seen testing out a blacked out Aero 98 in Phoenix and Miami. Beyond just 2025 though, we've seen a lot more players already adopting these modern players' rackets, and usually from more control-oriented frames. I'm also sure that part of the reason why Keys and Tsitsipas are so willing to take that leap is because they've seen their peers be very successful with them as well. For example, the current V-Core 98, which is the most powerful and spin-friendly V-Core ever, has been extremely well received on the Pro Tour. Tommy Paul switched to it from the Blade in 2023 and instantly shot up the rankings, and now Joao Fonseca is showing just how hard it can hit in the hands of a confident, aggressive player. Kyrgios has been using an E-Zone 98 his whole career, and it clearly complements his powerful and spin-friendly style very well. And now Ben Shelton is also demonstrating its big hitting potential. Alexei Popyrin was using a 95 score inch PT57A when he turned pro. Then he switched to the FX 500 Tour, which is way more powerful, and he's clearly doing pretty well and not really suffering from any control issues. Then you've got the whole Aero 98 crew. It seems like that racket is popping up in the hands of every young big hitter. Alcaraz, Rune, and Fils are all playing dominant, aggressive tennis with it. What we can take from all these racket switches and the fact that so many players are now playing with more powerful rackets is that tennis has evolved.
Le football, il a changé.
The game requires more power and pace from the players themselves, so the dominant pro racket has shifted from something super controlled to something more powerful and spin-friendly. And there have always been shifts in tennis, despite that hesitation to switch rackets, because we're not playing with wooden rackets, we're not playing with 85s, and I think this is the next big shift going on right now. Now, we do need to give the brand some credit for making that possible by developing these hybrid rackets, and it's not just modern players' rackets that represent that shift. Almost every racket line in 2025 is more powerful, more spin-friendly, and more stable than it was a decade ago. You look at rackets like the T-Fight and the Gravity Pro, which are some of the most popular thin-beam control rackets right now, even they generate enough power and spin to be competitive in these faster-paced rallies. I also think that recreational players like me can take huge inspiration from the fact that even the best players in the world are looking for help from their rackets to generate more power. I've always gravitated towards control rackets because I find that's what gives me the most confidence, but this is proof that the goalpost has moved for what's considered controlled versus less controlled. I'm not saying that control rackets are dead, but what I am saying is that it's always good to adapt, And the fact that even the most finicky, superstitious group of players are willing to do that is proof that maybe sometimes the grass is greener on the other side. I'm going to recommend 5 rackets that you should try if you're sold on this idea that more power and more spin could be beneficial to your game. Try the Pure Aero 98, the E-Zone 98, the Speed MP, the Extreme Pro, and the V-Core 98. Those are really the 5 best modern players rackets right now, in my opinion. If you don't want to take quite as big of a step, because again, these rackets do feel quite different to true control rackets, you can try the Technofiber T-Fight 305S, the Gravity Pro, the Boom Pro, and either Pure Strike 98. They're a little more traditional in their feel and control profiles, but still give you more power and spin than classic control rackets. I'm convinced that one of these rackets can work for anyone because they are so well-rounded, but again, if you do end up preferring classic control rackets or even classic power rackets, don't worry, they're not going anywhere. I also want to address something that I talked about in a recent video. These modern players rackets perform very well, but they don't provide the same feel experience as control rackets. For players who play tennis to win, they're really good, but if you play tennis for the gorgeous sensation that you get from a classic racket, you're not going to get that with them. I still prefer to play with control rackets, I'm not going to lie. I don't play tennis to compete anymore. I play it because I just love the way it feels, and for me, something like this is still the holy grail for that feel. But again, if you're competing, these modern players rackets might just give you that little extra edge you need. But anyways, that is going to be the end of this video. Hopefully you liked this style. I am thinking of making more pro tennis related content in the future, so if you did like it, please let me know. Otherwise, remember that if you want to demo any of the rackets we talked about here today, you can come visit us in store, or if you want to buy them, you can go online at racketsandrunners.ca.